Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Tuesday, 18 March 2025. It is the 195th anniversary of the birth of French historian Numa-Denis Fustel de Coulanges, who was born in Paris on this date in 1830. Fustel de Coulanges was one of the great historians of the 19th century. His reputation primarily rests on his book, The Ancient City, much of the content of which was already implicitly present in his doctoral thesis, Polybius and the Roman Conquest of Greece, How Hellenic Disunity Gave Rise to Roman Rule. Why the Greeks were disunified is a function of the history of the ancient city, as Fustel de Coulanges tells it. And he himself provides the best summary of his book on the very last page of it in a few short, crisp sentences. Quote, "We have written the history of a belief. It was established and human society was constituted. It was modified and society underwent a series of revolutions. It disappeared and society changed its character. Such was the law of ancient times." Unquote. That's the kind of laconic eloquence we don't usually get and we don't usually expect from historians. What was the belief to which Fustel de Coulanges refers? The belief in question is the religious life of archaic peoples. In his inaugural lecture of 1862, he gave another admirable summary, this time of this archaic religious belief. Quote, "A general conception of man, having become a real religion in Greece and in Italy, was the basis of the Greek and Roman family, had set up the marriage customs, had determined the bonds of kinship in a manner somewhat different from ours, had founded the right of property, and had finally consecrated the rights of inheritance in accordance with the very order of succession which had appeared to me so strange at first, and since then very logical. I saw afterwards that the same cluster of beliefs, having broadened and extended the family, founded a larger association, the city. Family and city had, in fact, the same constitution, the same laws, the same customs, and that is why in this study I have brought the two together as being inseparable." Unquote. For Fustel de Coulanges, the particularism of ancient religion, translated from the family gods to the gods of the city, was the basis of social order. The Greek regime of city-states was a concrete embodiment of this particularism, and when this ancient particularism began to crumble before ideas of universalism, especially from Christianity, the ancient city-states yielded to the cosmopolitan Roman Empire. One thing I find particularly interesting about the ancient city is that the end of the ancient city, as Fustel de Coulanges would have it, coincides with what in other contexts is often identified as a high point in Roman civilization, when Rome had several hundred years of stable life behind it and several hundred years of stable life yet before it. This apparently stable world was the end of the ancient city, and the institutions of the ancient city fully unraveled, and the institution that was the ancient city ceased to exist at this time. The cities themselves continued to exist. We could say that the built environment continued to exist and constituted a kind of invariant in the social transition that took place. But these cities now supervened on distinct social institutions, and the household gods were no longer the ordering principle of the ancient polis and of the populations of the empire. In this way, Fustel de Coulanges interpolates the termination of one great period of Western civilization and the beginning of another great period of Western civilization right in the midst of a period which for other historians has enjoyed unquestioned continuity. What distinctive methodology brought Fustel de Coulanges to this distinctive and unorthodox periodization of the ancient world? Like J.B. Bury, Fustel de Coulanges explicitly expressed the view that history is not an art, but a science, and he viewed himself as a scientific historian. Quote, "History is and should be a science. Its object, surely one of the most sublime that could be suggested for the study of man, is man himself. Man, who to be wholly known requires several sciences for himself. The physiologist studies his body. The psychologist and the historian share the study of his soul. The psychologist determines what is immutable in him, his nature, his faculties, his intellectual power, his conscience. The historian observes what changes, what is variable in man's soul, his beliefs, the trends and changes of his ideas, along with the things that are transformed with these ideas, that is, laws, institutions, art, and science, unquote. More than this, Fustel de Coulanges identified as a Cartesian historian. In Paul Guiraud's biography of Fustel de Coulanges, not yet translated into English, Guiraud quoted Fustel Coulanges as saying, quote, Jules Simon explained to me 38 years ago Descartes' discourse on method. From this came all my work, because this Cartesian doubt that he had brought into my mind, I applied to history, unquote. Elsewhere in the same book, Guiraud quoted him as saying, quote, in history as in philosophy, a methodical doubt is necessary. The true scholar, like the philosopher, begins by being a doubter, unquote. It was then Cartesian methodological doubt that led Fustel de Coulanges to his unorthodox conclusions. In my episode on Descartes, I characterized Cartesian thought as a non-philosophy of history, and I emphasized how Descartes' lack of interest in history translated into a more general lack of interest in history throughout the scientific revolution in which Descartes was so influential. Descartes, in particular, emphasized an influence over French intellectual life that we could compare to the influence that Kant exercised over German intellectual life. And so it was finally in the 19th century that Fustel de Coulanges saw himself as applying the Cartesian method to history. He wrote in his Questions historiques, also not translated into English for the best of my knowledge, quote, we must do as Descartes did. The historical method resembles the philosophical method at least in one respect. We must believe only in what is demonstrated. Now, when it comes to the ancients, there is no conjecture or modern system that can demonstrate a truth to us. The only proofs come from the ancients themselves. The moderns can sometimes serve as support for us. We are happy to be able to say that we meet great minds and learned men like Niebuhr, Mommsen, and Lang, etc. We are unhappy to admit that we deviate from them. But it does not matter, we must say, of these scholars what Descartes did of his masters. Conviction is not formed by the word of the master, but by documents, unquote. In my episode on Marc Bloch, I quoted Bloch quoting Fustel de Coulanges as saying, quote, supposing 100 specialists had divided the past of France according to lot, do you think that, in the end, they would have written the history of France? I very much doubt it. At the very least, they should miss the linkage of facts. Now, this linkage is itself a historical truth, unquote. In the same passage, Bloch also quotes a letter from Michelet to the effect that, quote, a great vital movement was needed because all these diverse elements gravitated together in the unity of the story, unquote. Bloch wanted to show that these two historians, Fustel de Coulanges and Michelet, both were wrestling with the problem of historical wholes. I wrestle with this problem too, although in a different way, and I'm going to try to describe the problems I find in the analysis of historical wholes. I want to consider this idea at greater length, and where I'm going with this argument might not be clear at first, but if you stick with me, I think you'll see where I'm going with this. Henri Bergson also contrasted the various different perspectives that we can take on a whole with the whole itself. Bergson was from the same French intellectual milieu as Fustel de Coulanges, and so inevitably was influenced by Descartes, but I don't think anyone would have called Bergson a Cartesian. In some way, Bergson's purpose is antithetical to that of Fustel de Coulanges, and so also antithetical to Descartes. since he wanted to contrast the intuitive method of metaphysics, as he saw it, with the analytical methods of science. Fustel de Coulanges thought history was a science, and even that it was effectively a Cartesian science, as we've seen in the earlier quotes I drew from him. Bergson, on the other hand, wanted to demonstrate the limitations of scientific thought, hence the need for metaphysics and what he believed to be the intuitive method of metaphysics in contradistinction to the analytical method of science. Still, the two of them, Fustel de Coulanges and Bergson, used a similar contrast between a whole and partial perspectives on that whole to illustrate a problem about knowledge. Fustel de Coulanges contrasted 100 different perspectives on history with the actual whole of history, which includes the connections between the facts established by specialist histories. The linkage between the facts of specialist histories are themselves historical truth, Fustel de Coulanges held, and these linkages are missed in any decomposition of the object of historical knowledge. Bergson used the example of an artist who visits Paris and makes a number of sketches. Bergson writes, quote, "Beneath all the sketches he has made at Paris, the visitor will probably, by way of memento, write the word Paris. And as he has really seen Paris, he will be able, with the help of the original intuition he had of the whole, to place his sketches therein, and so join them up together. But there is no way of performing the inverse operation. It is impossible, even with an infinite number of accurate sketches, and even with the word Paris, which indicates that they must be combined together, to get back to an intuition that one has never had, and to give oneself an impression of what Paris is like if one has never seen it." Unquote. Bergson's point is that the sketches of Paris don't represent proper parts of Paris, proper parts in the sense of being ontologically independent. And Bergson's solution, which certainly isn't Fustel de Coulanges' solution, is that we place ourselves within an object by means of intellectual sympathy, Bergson says, quote, "in order to coincide with what is unique in it and consequently inexpressible," unquote. The idea that something is lost through analysis is a familiar one and was forcefully expressed by Wordsworth, who said, "We murder to dissect." Another way to put it is that any analysis of a whole into parts involves relinquishing the linkages between the parts present in the whole, but lacking in the individual parts. We analyze a whole by bringing concepts to bear upon it and breaking it down in accord with the internal logic of the concepts we employ. If we use the concept passenger, for example, to analyze the people on a bus, we'll come up with a definite number of passengers, but in the concrete reality of history, every passenger has a history from which we have abstracted by treating each of them as passengers only. Also on the bus, the passengers have a definite number of spatial relations with other passengers of the same bus, but the bus taken as a whole and not merely as a vehicle for passengers, but we have abstracted from this also with the concept of passenger. Suppose someone on the bus experiences sudden cardiac arrest and collapses. The bus driver asks if there is a doctor among the passengers. Now we are further analyzing passengers into occupations, but merely as passengers, none of these individuals had a profession. This abstraction, the property of being a physician, recurs to the individual histories of the different passengers previously abstracted from when we were only using the concept passenger and not employing the concept doctor. Suddenly, these properties become relevant again after having been abstracted from. So the conceptual filter of abstraction may vary according to our immediate needs. In my newsletters over the past year or more, I've argued that all scientific concepts are abstractions, and what distinguishes one science from another is the distinctive form of abstraction employed in any given science. In addition, I've argued that one of the weaknesses of history is that it lacks distinctive forms of abstraction, and this holds history back from being fully scientific. It's not just a matter of how much we abstract or the degree of abstraction of a given concept. It's also a matter of that from which we abstract or the kind of abstraction involved in a given concept. We could call this the distinction between quantitative abstraction and qualitative abstraction. I've come to realize that history has routinely engaged in a form of quantitative abstraction, and this could be called a form of abstraction distinctive to history. So maybe history does have its own abstract concepts after all. Historians have traditionally taken a period of time and a geographical region out of the whole of history and have treated these selected places and times in abstraction from the rest of history. Fustel de Coulanges was aware of both the necessities and the dangers of the quantitative abstraction of places and periodization, and also of the abstraction represented by taking a particular perspective on history, which we can think of as a form of qualitative abstraction. He said in his 1862 inaugural election, quote, "Little by little, I got better acquainted with the ancients. I saw their customs, their beliefs, their needs, their laws. Minor points, seemingly insignificant and unnoticed, illuminated their institutions for me. It did not take me long to see that if these institutions are often misunderstood by us, this happens because we study them by themselves as abstractions without reckoning with the exigencies of the environment in which they originated, and above all, without giving thought to the state of mind and to the beliefs of the men for whom these institutions were made," unquote. He recognized that there's a problem with historical abstractions when they take institutions out of their proper context. In several episodes, I've discussed this necessity of abstraction and the related dangers involved with it. For example, in my episode on the Bolton thesis, I talked about how the claim of Herbert Eugene Bolton that the history of the Americas is rightly hemispherical history, and how this naturally grows from hemispherical history to world history, and how world history in turn naturally grows into big history. Fustel de Coulanges recognized this imperative to converge on the totality of history. And he said, quote, "History cannot be content to examine a single period in minute detail, to recount a brilliant biography, to select, in short, those events whose recital would delight us or move us the most. One must go back to antiquity. One must understand the institutions of people that have ceased to exist. One has to breathe life into the ancient generations that are no longer even dust. Where history has no written records, it must force dead languages to yield their secrets. In their grammatical forms and in their very words, it divines the thoughts of the men who spoke in them. It must probe the fables and myths, the dreams induced by man's imaginations, all of the old falsehoods beneath which it must discover something very real, the beliefs of man. Wherever man has lived, wherever he has left some feeble imprint of his life and his intelligence, there is history. History should encompass all centuries, since it is the traditional book in which the human soul inscribes its variations and its progress," unquote. So he says that history should encompass all centuries, but we can't always act on this imperative. We are forced to place some limits on our inquiry because without any limits, we wouldn't be able to begin. And without even more stringent limits, we wouldn't be able to finish. The finitude of the work of the historian necessarily entails limitation of the historian's task. And this observation points to another aspect of the earlier quote that I want to talk about today. Many historians have asserted that there are an infinitude of facts about the past from which the historian can at most select a small finite fragment. Carroll Quigley wrote that, quote, "It should require only a moment's thought to recognize that the facts of the past are infinite, and the possible arrangements of any selection from these facts are equally numerous," unquote. Fustel de Coulanges himself made a similar claim in the introduction to his History of the Political Institutions of Ancient France, where he wrote, quote, "History is not an easy science. Its subject is infinitely complex. Human society is like a body whose harmony and unity can be grasped only by examining successively and closely each of the organs which compose it and which are its life," unquote. The thesis that the object of historical knowledge is infinitely complex can be casually proposed by an historian, but a philosopher of history must regard that as a claim of distinctive interest that needs to be demonstrated or refuted. There are many different ways in which we might assert that history is infinitely complex. And these different ways don't all coincide. So one method of decomposing the past into an infinitude of parts won't necessarily agree with another method for decomposing the past into an infinitude of parts. For example, we could make a distinction between the diachronic infinity of the past and the synchronic infinity of the past. The diachronic infinitude of the past, regarding the infinite complexity of the temporal succession that makes up history, can itself be conceived in more than one way. We can think of the past as being infinitely extended to time, so that any exhaustive periodization would result in an infinite number of finite periods arranged in orderly succession end to end. However, if we conceive of the past as a continuum, that means that the past can be divided up into periods of any arbitrary duration, including infinitesimal periods. On the one hand, the decomposition of the continuum of the past into arbitrary periods could mean an infinite number of periods placed end to end. On the other hand, the ability to conceptualize the past in terms of arbitrary divisions of periodization could also be used to give us a finite number of periods of the same extent of time. However, given the infinite divisibility of a continuum, there are an infinitude of different ways in which we could decompose any past continuum into periods, so that the possibility of infinitistic history arises yet again from yet another application of this quantitative analysis. I alluded to this earlier when I said that Fustel de Coulanges interpolated the termination of one great period of Western civilization and the beginning of another great period of Western civilization right in the midst of a period that for other historians has enjoyed unquestioned continuity. In other words, he employed a different decomposition of time into periods than was customary. We could perform a similar analysis of space as it bears on the selection of a finite geographical area as the special concern of history. This would partially correspond to an analysis of a synchronic continuum parallel to the analysis I just made previously for a diachronic continuum with interaction substituted for succession. These are relatively simple conceptions that I previously called quantitative abstraction in history, but we can go further than this. In the quote from Quigley I made previously, he said that the past consists of an infinitude of facts. The decomposition of the past into facts is, again, different from the decomposition of the facts of the past into periods of time or regions of space, I should say. Not only could we argue that the world is constituted by an infinitude of facts, we could also argue that there are an infinitude of different ways in which we could decompose the world into an infinitude of facts. The idea of a fact is one of the grandest abstractions in all of science, shared alike by the natural sciences and the social sciences, but no one can say exactly what a fact is or what the limits are on facthood. Unless we place limitations on facts, then the fact that red is a color is co-equal with the fact that Earth is a planet, or the fact that the Milky Way galaxy is one of 3 spiral galaxies in the local cluster, along with the Andromeda and Triangulum galaxies. Without limiting the internal complexity of facts, we could say that the history of the world, or as Spengler would say, the world is history, is one grand fact, and then it stands on an equal footing with the simplest facts that constitute the world, what the logical positivists would later come to call atomic facts, unless we formulate a taxonomy of facts that differentiates among them. If we do formulate a taxonomy of facts, it could well be the case that there could be an infinitude of different kinds of facts. And this would be another sense, again, in which history could be said to be infinitistic. Or, if we insist that there are only a finite number of kinds of facts, this would be a sense in which history is definitively finitistic. Because of this fundamental ambiguity of what a fact is, history might be one, and might be a single fact, or it might be many facts, or it might be, as Quigley maintained, an infinitude of facts. My point here is that there are several senses in which we might claim that history is infinitely complex, but a lot more analysis is required to determine what exactly is meant by this claim, because we can equally well interpret history finitistically. We can't make good on Fustel de Coulanges' ambitions for scientific history until we clarify basic issues like this problem of in what ways we are to regard the past as infinite or not, in its extent, whether it's diachronic extent or its synchronic extent, in its complexity, in its facticity, or in some other sense. This, in turn, would require that we delve into metaphysics to clarify what constitutes a fact, what the basis is of the individuation of facts, and whether there are distinct kinds of facts, and if there are, what these kinds are, and how many kinds there are. Before we can exhibit the linkages of facts as historical truth, no less than the facts themselves, we must be able to give an account of what these facts are. These problems are what I have elsewhere described as the need to develop the conceptual framework of history, which at present is unequal to any of these tasks, and only can be made equal through foundational inquiries into the nature of historical thought. Happy birthday, Numa-Denis Fustel de Coulanges, and thanks for listening.